So, good afternoon and welcome. Herzlich willkommen to the drupa Cube. Get ready to be ink-spired, as I like to say. So what can you expect here at the Cube? It's a primary conference venue here at drupa, and we aim to bring you actionable insights, answering the challenges that your industry is facing. So we're looking at business leadership, global trends, future print and packaging technologies, and sustainability. Those are the main themes, and they often are, of course, intertwined. Next up this afternoon, we'll be looking at compliance of FCM, printed food contact materials. We will start with the worldwide regulations, and then we'll take a deep dive into the European regulations. Now, I'm amazed. I don't know if you will also be amazed at the very different levels of regulation, including none sometimes, which is why it's very important to work together to find solutions to stay one step ahead of the regulations, and that's where the European Printing Ink Association comes in, and we'll hear also about the concepts from the European Association. This session has been curated. It's a double session, curated by the VDL, which is the German Printing and Ink and Coating Association. It's my pleasure to introduce our dynamic duo. We have two presenters. They both have a PhD in chemistry, so we're in good hands. And to be fair, I will introduce them in alphabetical order. Our first speaker is Director of Food, Safety and Toxicology at Siegwerk Druckfarben. Druckfarben is printing colors. In this role since 2015, he has a global responsibility for FCM, food contact material regulations, and evaluations of ink ingredients for food packaging. He is also chairman of the European Printing Ink Association. So please put your hands together to welcome Dr. Evert Delbanco. Thank you. And completing the dynamic duo, our second speaker has had a fantastic career at Sun Chemical. He has been working there for 22 years, first developing sheet-fed offset inks in Europe, and later setting up a lab in France for combined central sheet-fed oil-based fed development, Today he is Global Technical Director for oil-based sheet-fed offset inks and water-based OPVs. I hope I get that all right. He is also an active and influential member both of the German Printing Ink Association and the European Association. A very warm welcome to Dr. Peter Wülfert. So, gentlemen, the stage is yours. I hand over to you. Thank you.
So we split in two sections.
Yes, I will start, and then I will take over to Peter. First of all, thank you very much for the warm words and for the introduction. And of course, thanks a lot to be able to speak here about key factors for compliance of printed food contact materials. You already mentioned part of the journey we will have together. But maybe short summary what you could expect within the next, I don't think we are talking about 2 hours, maybe 1 hour and some minutes. So I will take you first to a journey around the globe, focusing on some interesting food contact material regulations. So I picked out some of them. And for each of these regulations, you can have an own presentation. Yeah. So, but for these regulations, I only have one slide. Yeah. So bear with me. It's only a brief summary of regulations, so that you at least are aware on what principle, which principle they follow. Then I will come to Europe and take you from Europe to Switzerland, talking shortly about the Swiss ordinance, and then I will hand over to Peter, who will continue with the German ink ordinance and with EUPIA principles, European Printing Association principles, and how we make sure on association level that we are compliant. So, before I start with the journey, I would like to highlight that food contact materials are high-tech products, at least. So they have to fulfill many different requirements. First one is they need to ensure mechanical protection. Then they need to carry information about the product as such. A couple of information is also legally required. Then functionality must be given. So one example is barrier properties. Sustainability issues are also coming more and more prominent. So ingredients must fulfill sustainable approaches. Circularity is also an issue. So packages must be recyclable or should be recyclable, or even must or even have to be made from recycled materials. Next one is attractiveness of the product as such, but also, of course, of the brand, from the brand owner. And, of course, the packaging should be decorative, and the overarching principle of packaging is that no negative organoleptic impact on odor, taste should happen during filling, storage, or transport. So that's a short introduction, and now I would like to start with you the journey. Here you can see where we want to go. So, of course, these flags only represent 6 countries or regions, respectively. There are much more chemical regulations or food contact material regulations available around the globe. As I said, I only picked out a few of them. It is also important to mention that there are 2 general principles of food contact material legislation which are available. The first one is the positive list principle, which means only substances can be used which are listed on a positive list. And the advantage of this approach is that the substances which can be used are officially evaluated by regulators. So this principle has a high degree of safety. Unfortunately, substances which are not listed cannot be used and must be listed prior to use. So that means innovation is not that good if you have to follow a positive list principle. Negative list principle is just the opposite. All substances can be used except the substances which are on the negative list. So the level of freedom is much higher, but also the level of safety is lower. Yeah? So generally, 2 approaches, and I will come to that in the course of my presentation. So let's start with the US. So the most important regulation is the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 21, which simply is called Food and Drugs. Mostly relevant is the subchapter B, which is for food consumption, human food consumption. And if we go to the second point, this is the overarching principle in this regulation. It is a kind of framework regulation, saying current good manufacturing practice in manufacturing, packing or holding human food requires that the packed food must not be adulterated. So that is very important, and that's a kind of basic principle which needs to be followed. Generally, the safety of a substance is based on the exposure on diet, which is correlated to kind of packaging which is used, and of course on the migration. In the US, there is no specific regulation available dealing with printing inks. So that means that the converter has to evaluate the impact of inks based on the information which is provided by the printing ink manufacturer. And this makes it very important that the printing ink manufacturer transparently provides respective information which enables the converter to assess the packaging material. Then we go from the US in southern direction to Mercosur, to the Mercosur countries, which are Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Venezuela. Here, a kind of framework regulation has been already implemented in 1992. It is quite similar to the European approach, saying no transfer of harmful or toxic compounds from packaging to food should happen, no unacceptable change in food composition, taste, or odor, and in addition to that, food contact materials should be manufactured in accordance to good manufacturing practice. There's another resolution which is also important to mention in order to have the complete picture of the Mercosur countries. This is Resolution 56, also from 1992, which, by the way, has recently amended. Here, in OML, the overall migration limit is mentioned to be 60 milligram per kilogram. And this has currently increased from 50. So a kind of adaptation to European standard. And in addition to that, also quite similar to Europe, I will come to that later, there's also a plastic regulation available in Mercosur, which also has a positive list of monomers or other starting substances, and this positive list has to be applied for plastics. So then we continue our journey from Mercosur to China. In China, there are national standards for food contact materials and articles available. The umbrella document is GB 48061, which is outlining general requirements. And then there are several standards for uses of additives in food contact materials and articles available. And for printing inks, the most important one is the chapter A4. And this chapter contains around 200 different substances. And this is the so-called Chinese positive list. There are other lists for coatings, for plastics, but for printing inks, the relevant list is the list A4. In addition to that, there's also the GB 31603, which is a kind of quite similar to good manufacturing practice. And under the umbrella document, the GB 4806, there are many different product standards available from number 2 to 14, and the most recent one is the number 14, and it is for inks. And this GB 4806-14 is also known as Chinese Ink Ordinance, which is quite fresh and which will come into force in September this year. And the challenge, or I have to say the problem in China, is that the positive list, the chapter A4 of the GB 9685, only consists of around 200 substances, which is very low. And to be honest, which is not sufficient in order to manufacture printing inks. And this is a huge problem. In order to give you an idea, on the positive list of the Swiss ordinance, there are around 1,000 substances, which is sufficient. So that's a problem in terms of China. And in order to emphasize that, the Chinese printing ink regulation, the printing ink ordinance in China is based on a positive list principle. In India, it is just the other way around. Here we have a negative list. The umbrella document has been implemented already in 2006 from the regulatory body, which is the Food Safety and Standard Authority of India, FSSAI. And this was the Food Safety and Standards Act. And below this Food Safety and Standards Act, there's a Food Safety and Standards Packaging Regulation established in 2018, dealing with different food contact materials. And printing inks have to comply to the Indian standard 15495, and in this standard there's a negative list. Yeah? So that means substances which are listed there cannot be used. All other substances can be used, and it's also very important to mention that direct food contact in India is forbidden. So it's forbidden to have the printed side, for example, inside, so that it is in direct contact with food. Finally, let's go from India to Japan. So Japan is a tricky country in terms of regulation. So there's a positive list existing since 2020. But it covers polymers, monomers, and additives used in synthetic resins, which are permitted for food contact materials. And printing inks are not directly affected by the rules, so they are not in scope of the regulation. Yeah? But there's a voluntary regulation on association level available in Japan. Its association is called JPIMA, which is the Japan Printing Ink Makers Association. And the latest version of this voluntary list, it is a negative list, is from May 2020, which means all substances, around 700 substances, which are listed on this list, should not be used, but it is on a voluntary basis. We will come later on to the OIPIA principles, which will be covered by Peter, and he will introduce you to the OIPIA exclusion policy, which is also an initiative on association level. What the difference is that in Japan it is a voluntary issue. In Europe, with the OIPIA, it's mandatory for the members, and the Japanese negative list is specifically focusing and mentioning substances, and the OIPIA exclusion policy is focusing on certain categories of hazard. So let's come back from our trip through the world to Europe. And this is the current status of European legislation. And what you see here is the European Framework Regulation. It is the trunk of the tree, symbolizes the EU Framework Regulation. And I will show you in the next slide the main requirements, or the most important requirement of the Framework Regulation. But you can see here, there are the tree top consists of different regulations like ceramics, plastic materials, and they are connected to the trunk. Which means For these specific food contact materials, there are specific regulation available. And there are shots at the top, and these symbolize materials which have not been regulated yet. For example, printing inks are not regulated, specifically regulated on European level at the moment, and coatings as well, adhesives, rubbers, metals. So the majority of potential food contact materials have no specific regulation at the moment in Europe. Let's go back to the trunk of the tree, which is the framework regulation. And here, very important article is the article number 3, saying that materials shall be manufactured in compliance with the good manufacturing practice, and no transfer of substances to the food should happen which endanger human health, which bring a change in composition of the food, and third point, which bring a deterioration in the organoleptic characteristics. So this is the basic framework principle laid down in Article 3, and this holds true for all food contact material independently, whether there's a additional specific regulation available or not. I just mentioned in the Article 3 of the framework regulation, there's a good manufacturing practice mentioned. We even have a good manufacturing practice regulation in Europe available. It's from 2020. It's from 2000, already from 2006, and the basic principle of this good manufacturing practice is consumer safety and quality. And there are a couple of requirements in this good manufacturing practice regulation, like management system should be available, material selection, raw material selection should be done according to pre-established specifications, operations should be done according to pre-established procedures. Printing surface should also not come into direct contact with food. And it's also highlighting not only migration, but also set-off, which should be kept under control by meeting certain limits. And finally, documentation of compliance should be available in case of inspections or requests by authorities. Then, also in Europe, I mentioned it when I talked about Mercosur regulation. Also in Europe, there's a plastic regulation available. And if you remember the trunk of the tree, in this specific case, a limb for the plastic regulation was connected to the trunk. That means for plastics, there's a specific regulation available. For plastic food contact materials, there's a specific regulation available in the European Union. And also following positive list principle, there are rules available for migration testing. In the positive list, there are specific migration limits available which need to be met and which need to be fulfilled. Overall migration limit is similar to Mercosur, 60. And risk assessments, that's also important to mention. As soon as substances are not listed in the positive list, and for example, non-intentionally added substances, there's no need for non-intentionally added substances that they are listed. They need to be assessed in line with the principles of Article 3 of the Framework Regulation. And coming back to printing inks. So for printing inks, strictly spoken, the plastic regulation is not applicable. We follow the principle that as soon as there are limits available in the positive list of the plastic regulation, and we are talking about printed plastic food contact materials, they should be met. If there are no limits available, then also these substances can be assessed according to well-known risk assessment principles. And finally, also a requirement of the plastic regulation, a declaration of compliance is mandatory. Now, I leave a little bit the regulatory requirements, coming to additional requirements and to guiding principles. So, for example, guiding principles are available from EFSA side, European Food Safety Agency, and also from the Federal Institute of Risk Assessment, so the German BFR, which can help in assessing substances. But I also have to mention that the legal compliance, or the compliance, I have to say the compliance, is not only the legal compliance. We are also talking about converter or brand owner compliance and our self-commitments. And if I talk about self-commitments, I'm back to the exclusion policy, which will be covered by Peter in some minutes. But also converters, many converters and also brand owners, they have their own requirements, which go very often far beyond what is legally required in certain regions. And of course, we as ink manufacturer, as soon as we are printing for these converters or brand owners, we also need to fulfill these additional requirements. Now, I would like to give you a short outlook what will come or what we will expect on European level. So a lot of things are going on in terms of regulation in Europe. So maybe you have heard about the Green Deal, which was published December 2019 by the European Commission. And the Green Deal has three main streams. The first one is the chemical strategy of sustainability. The second one is the circular economy action plan. And the third one is the farm to fork strategy. And if we talk about the revision of the European framework regulation, it falls under the farm to fork part. And what do we have to expect? So the focus will be in future on the final article, which means that a producer is fully accountable of the product. And that means all migratables must be known, and there's no difference anymore between IS and NIS. This difference will disappear. So it's only about migrants and not about intentionally or non-intentionally added substances. This is really a game changer. Secondly, substances will be prioritized according to their hazard. And there is at the moment, there's a three-tier approach. So tier 1 are substances which are banned. For example, CMR substances will fall under this category. And I'm not talking only about CMR category 1. I'm talking about CMR category 1 plus category 2. Tier 2 are substances, they call it other hazardous substances. And these substances are subject to an authorization procedure. And tier 3 are non-hazardous materials, which are under the responsibility of the producer. Third thing which will change, improving communication along the supply chain, enabling a strong enforcement by authorities and a high level of compliance. And finally, supporting more sustainable alternatives. So this means that hazardous materials have to be substituted by less hazardous materials if possible. So, for example, if you read presentations or listen to presentations from the Commission, so they already mentioned substances should be inherently safe and substances should not migrate at all. So that's the direction the Commission wants to go, and that will be really a challenge. And in order to give you an idea about the time, we are talking about 2027, 2028. So not very soon, but time is running. So now I leave the European Union and go short trip to Switzerland. Switzerland is interesting simply for the reason because at the moment the Swiss ordinance is the only regulation on global scale dealing with printing inks. The German ink ordinance will follow, will be covered by Peter, but Swiss ordinance, they were the first, and also the Swiss ordinance, the scope is indirect food contact and is also based on a positive list principle, and substances can only be used which are listed on the positive list, and maybe you know there are part A and a part B, and in the most important part is the part A, and the part B contains substances which do not migrate above 10 ppb, but even if these substances migrating below 10 ppb, they have to be listed in part B. What will happen? There was a revision of the Swiss ordinance in February this year and will be enforced by February 2026, which means the part B of the Swiss ordinance will disappear. So that's a kind of harmonization with the German ink ordinance. But what does it mean? So that means if you have intentionally added substances migrating below 10 ppb, so there's right now no need anymore that these substances are listed in the Swiss ordinance, so they do not need to be transferred to part A. You can use them, but you need to make sure that they are not migrating above 10 ppb and that they do not have CMR properties, carcinogenic, mutagenic, and reprotoxic properties. And it's really an interesting question. What does it mean? What does CMR properties mean? And this is currently a subject to discussion with the Swiss authorities, because some people very bluntly say if a substance is not classified as CMR, then a substance is not CMR. I have to say, as a toxicologist, I have problems to follow this argumentation simply because a non-classification can be based on data gaps. So if there are no data, then you cannot classify. So that means only if data are available and these data show that no classification is required, then you can be sure that a substance is not CMR. And as I said, the exact procedure, which principle have to be applied in order to make sure that a substance is not CMR, that's subject to current discussion with the Swiss authorities. In addition to that, also a so-called declaration of conformity for printing inks must be provided in order to provide all relevant information to the printer, to the converter, which he needs for his compliance work. And the good news is that the statement of composition, which is a standard format on EUPIA level, fulfills all the requirements and can be used. So, and now we come to the German ink ordinance, and I'm happy to hand over to Peter. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Evert. Thank you all for still being here, as this is quite a tough discussion. And we went from a global overview to little Switzerland. And you have heard that Switzerland has the only global ink ordinance, printing ink ordinance. That's a pity. It's really a pity, and unfortunately the German authorities are of the same opinion. And Evert showed us, or told us, that in the European Union the work is delayed, and we will not get a European regulation for printing inks, maybe before I'm retired. So, Germany said, that's too long. They don't want to wait anymore. I don't subscribe to this point of view, but okay, so be it. And they put into force the German ink ordinance. It's not the official title. It's called like this from everybody, and we as well call it like this. It is not a specific ink ordinance. It's a part of the consumer goods ordinance. So they just added some articles specifically for printing inks. This means, basically, this ordinance focuses on the final food contact material. We have to be aware of this because the converter or the packer needs to fulfill the consumer goods ordinance. We, as printing ink manufacturers, we now will get some rules how our printing inks have to look like. But this does not say that when you take a printing ink that fulfills the needs of the German ink ordinance, you're fine. Your process, the printing, the converting, etc., needs to be carefully made as well to fulfill the final consumer goods ordinance. We have a transition period which was taken quite long, unusually 4 years, until 1st of January 2026. It's only 1.5 years left, and not a lot has happened in the European Union. So we really assume that the German ink ordinance will come into force 1st January of 26, because the German authority says in the case that something happens in the European Union, they will take it back. But it doesn't look like this. So we assume it will come into force January 2026. This German ink ordinance, what you see here, looks very similar to what you have heard from the Swiss ordinance. The two authorities work together, and the difference, nevertheless there are differences, unfortunately. The difference is that the German ink ordinance also covers inks for direct food contact, while the Swiss only talk about outside printing, means non-direct food contact. So we now will get a regulation which also talks about direct food contact. And the regulation says which substances can be used in printing inks for direct food contact. For example, only the substances which are listed. There's a positive list again. And the plastic regulation, which was mentioned several times as well, these substances can be taken as well, as long as there are no restrictions. This makes sense because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter where a substance comes from. Is it from ink, from the substrate, from the glue, or wherever? If the substance comes into the food, the hazard needs to be assessed for the substance, not for the way it came in. And some other rules are there for direct food contact inks. And some special exemption for 1 more year for some pigments, which is not a lot of time, which will not make a lot of change. On the other hand, non-direct food contact inks are regulated as well, of course, and the same rules apply, plus it is possible to use not listed substances. This is exactly what Evert just explained from the Swiss ordinance, what they are doing now. They're taking back their list B, and it is allowed to use substances which are not listed as long as they are not detectable, which right now is the 10 ppb limit. It's not a hazard-based limit, it's a detection limit. And they must not be classified as CMR. We heard this before. So it's the same principles here. Not intentionally added substances are the same in this context as non-listed substances. As long as they are not on this positive list, they can be used if they fulfill these rules. And the outlook really is that we are awaiting this ordinance to come into force. The downside of the positive list we have already heard. It's normally substances which are on the positive list which are used in printing inks, not printing inks as such. This means these are the raw material suppliers who must deliver the necessary data for getting these substances on the list. We as printing ink manufacturers, of course, we are interested that substances get on the list which we want to use or which we are using in printing inks for food contact materials. So we support as much as we can, but we are not the owner of the data. We are not the producer of many of these substances. This means that the addition of new substances will be complicated. And it's a lengthy process. Evert already mentioned that this is not good for innovation. We need, or the substance manufacturers need to support with the necessary toxicological data, and the BFR is very strict. They demand a lot, and it is foreseeable that until January 26, not a lot of additional substances will come on the list. Some will make it, but not a lot. This means that in most of the cases, the list already gives us substances which we are using today, but not all of the inks produced today for food contact materials can be used as they are for when the German ink ordinance comes into force. It means in some cases we will have to reformulate before January 26 in order to fulfill all these needs. So this is especially true for UV inks where some photo initiators are missing on this positive list, which are, for example, on the Swiss list. Don't ask me why the two were not able to have one common list, but that's the case. So we, as the Ink Makers Association, we have given some webinars 2 years ago in order to explain what's going to happen. This was very well taken, and we will do this most probably again when we come closer to January 26 to give our customers the necessary information before the deadline. Okay, so now we have heard about regulations worldwide for printing inks which are almost non-existing, and where we try to help ourselves with other regulations like the plastic regulation, for example, in order to be able to produce at the end of the day food contact material which is safe. We face this situation since decades. So the industry, in our case, our association, the European Printing Ink Association, we have worked out concepts, rules, etc. for our members, what they have to do in order to produce printing inks which are safe for this application. And I want to show you some of them. So again, there is legal compliance which we have to fulfill. There are our self-commitments which I will come to, and the brand owner requirements which were mentioned already, which are sometimes going beyond the legal requirements. These are the 3 pillars we built our concepts on. And maybe this is the most important slide of the presentation. It is very important that the whole supply chain works together. We need to work with our raw material suppliers. They need to know for what we are using these raw materials. We need to give the necessary information to our customers, who then produce the packaging and give it to the converter, and at the end of the day to the brand owner. The whole supply chain must work together in both directions in order to fulfill the needs. At the end of the day, we are all consumers, and we want to eat safe food, of course. These are the concepts which I will talk about shortly, which we have developed over the last decades, and which all deal with food packaging. One was, so here again, these are the ones that we are partly producing for our members, but partly also for our customers, to give them guidance as well, to give them the data they need. First, I want to talk about is one which is not especially made for food contact materials, which is made for all inks and coatings. This UPIA exclusion policy, where we, as an industry, define which substances we do not want to use, whether there is a regulation for that or not. This is a self-commitment where we exclude certain very hazardous, toxic substances to not be used in printing inks manufactured by a UPIA member. This is also valid then, of course, for food contact printing inks. What happens if a reclassification happens and a substance which is used today falls into one of these 2 groups which we exclude? There is a substitution need, and our members, they have committed to work on substituting such substances. Depending on which group it is, they have to say when they will substitute, and if they cannot substitute within a certain time, they have to show why, and they have to show what they are going to do in order to substitute. So we have given us pretty strict rules that make sure that UPIA members are not using these substances when they fall into these categories, at least that they are not using them for a long time. They need to substitute. And we even have established committees and boards that neutrally discuss the cases where a company says, I work on the substitution, but I need some time for it because of this, of that reason. So this is all very strict, and our members are committed to fulfill these rules. Therefore, this policy is widely referenced. Also, brand owners request that their packaging, some of the brand owners request that their packaging is printed with inks which fulfill the UPIA exclusion policy. It's a very valuable paper. Beside that, now we come to the food contact materials. We have a guideline which tells us from the printing ink makers how to produce printing inks made for food packaging and coatings. When I say printing inks, I always take coatings into account as well. We cover as well non-direct food contact inks as direct contact inks. And in the absence of regulations, what we have heard, this guideline tells our members how they can fulfill the needs of the framework directive. This framework directive, which just says you should not endanger human health, but it doesn't tell you how you can do this. So we have developed rules and guidelines for our members, how they can do it. So these requirements are laid down there, the selection criteria for raw materials, and so on, and so on. We have heard about a European regulation for good manufacturing practice. It is 3 pages long, and it only covers non-direct food contact. So this is not really suitable for your daily work in order to develop a printing ink which can be used on food contact materials. Therefore, we have made our own UPIA GMP, which is much more detailed, which clearly explains how to produce a printing ink. It's not just taking substances which are allowed, substances from the list, but of course it's the production. There is potential of contamination if you don't take care when you produce a printing ink, when you fill it into a container, when you ship it, etc., etc. So we have set up rules for our members how to produce, how to make really inks under good manufacturing practice. This paper is publicly available. You can have a look on the UPIA website for the publicly available papers which are covering a wide area, not only food packaging. And this good manufacturing practice contains all these chapters, everything which is important for producing food contact printing inks which are safe to make food contact packaging later on. UV, I mentioned before already, UV is a special case because UV is reactive chemistry. Photoinitiators, acrylates, they react with each other. They are reactive chemicals, and as such, they are classified, normally classified as dangerous goods. And over the last years, more and more of these substances came into categories which we need to exclude due to our exclusion policy. So UV is a special area where it is even harder to formulate food contact inks, and we have set up, for example, a list of suitable photoinitiators for UV printing. And this is also referenced by, for example, by brand owners. So it is not just a list where we try to list everything that we need, but really everything that is suitable for food contact materials. Then, of course, we have to prove that the printing inks are fulfilling the necessary regulations, and migration is one of the basic principles. There should not be any substance migrating into the food from the printing ink above certain limits. The limits can go up to 60 parts per million if the substance is safe enough. This is the overall limit, the overall migration limit. They can be specific down to 10 ppb, for example, which is today the detection limit. And we have set up guidance how to test migration. And beside migration, there are, of course, other possibilities. Worst case calculation. That's the easiest, the first way. You just make a calculation how much of a substance is in my ink. If I assume 100% is transferred into the food, does it exceed the limit or not? And if you don't exceed the limit, then you're fine. But of course, there are cases where this theoretical calculation will show you can exceed the limit. Then you need to make migration modeling, which is available as well, which exists and has been improved over the years. or real migration tests. And this is, of course, according to existing regulations. The plastic regulation already contains a chapter about migration tests, and we do not reinvent the wheel. Of course, we reference to the plastic regulation when we talk about migration tests. But we clearly give for each ink technology, for each substrate, our members the guidance how to make migration tests, so that at the end of the day we are sure that printing inks from UPIA members are safe. NIAS is another item which is discussed very often. Not intentionally added substances, something which we sometimes even do not know that they are in our inks, and at the end of the day that they are in the food packaging material. NIAS can be everywhere, in inks, in substrates, glues, etc. And these substances are often not listed in the positive lists where we have one, plastic regulation, Swiss ordinance, and now the coming German ink ordinance. So they need to be assessed. They need to be assessed, Evert already said this, following toxicological principles, agreed principles from the European Food Safety Authority. So we are not setting up our own rules, we are using the existing ones, how to assess a not intentionally added substance or a not listed substance. And therefore we have given us rules and guidelines how to do this, so that our assessment is accepted afterwards from the authorities. That's very important, because if we make an assessment where the authorities later on say, no, you did not do it right, then it doesn't help anybody. At the end of the day, this risk assessment will end up with a self-derived SML, where we then can say, where is the limit, the safe limit, that this substance can really be used in food contact materials. And this allows to use substances which are not listed. Otherwise, always the 10 ppb limit applies. But sometimes it could be that they are over this limit. And then we have produced a lot of data. What are we doing with this data? We give this data to our customers, because at the end of the day, we are not producing the food contact material. We are just producing one part of it. And the final compliance need to be assured at the end from the finished food packaging. So we call it statement of composition. Why do we call it like this? Because we have no regulation where we can state compliance to beside the Swiss ordinance today. Therefore, we cannot make a compliance statement to what? There is nothing beside Swiss ordinance. So we call it statement of composition, which means we give our customers details about the substances which can migrate and which we know about. Substances which we use as raw materials, and substances which we are not using ourselves as a raw material, but where we have the knowledge that they are in the raw material. So we request a lot of data from our suppliers, so that we do not only know the main substance that we buy as a raw material, but also potential impurities, contaminations, etc. And then we make the statement of composition. We give our customers exact data of how much is theoretically in the printing ink, how much they can expect at the end in the migration test. So I give you an example. I give you two examples actually. Let's take a plasticizer, bis-diethylhexyl adipate. A plasticizer where we, and this is how the statement of composition in principle looks like. We give the CAS number of the substance, If available, the reference number of the plastic regulation. In the case of the plasticizer, it is in the plastic regulation, the chemical name, and here you get the SML values which are available. As it is already in the plastic regulation, there is a limit given of here of 18 ppm. And of course, the Swiss ordinance takes the same. And the future German ink ordinance, when it comes into force, will be added. This is now grayed out a little bit here. It will be added in this list, and you see all the three limits are the same because we are not developing own limits for each regulation. If there is a limit existing on toxicological data, it is taken from everybody. So it could be that this substance is a food additive, then we mention it here as well. In this case, it is not. And then we give the maximum amount in the dried ink film so that our customers can make their calculation later on for the specific packaging they are producing. And then we give some comments, for example, if it's a reactive substance, or when we have made a risk assessment for not intentionally added substances, we give this in the statement of composition as well. Second example, the one on the bottom, again, CAS number. In this case, it's not in the plastic regulation, therefore there is no limit given there. But there is one in the Swiss ordinance, so this substance has been assessed. The Swiss ordinance has given a limit of 50 ppb. Here the table shows ppm, but 0.05 ppm is 50 ppb. And then this will also be the limit in the German ink ordinance if it comes into force. And again, the comments. And like this, with all this data, the rules, the guidelines that we have produced for ourselves, but also for our customers, we make sure that whilst there is no clear regulation, our inks are safe to make food packaging from. And this, I think, is the most important message at the end of the day. And I hope that this was pretty clear, but of course, if there are now questions, because we could not go into details, in many cases, if there are specific questions, we are happy to answer them. So, short summary, we showed you that the world is not similar in regulation for food contact materials and printing inks. Especially in Europe, we have everything from very detailed regulation, this is Switzerland, up to nothing for printing inks itself. Therefore, we try to fill these gaps with our own concepts we have worked on for many, many years, and we are, of course, updating. Most of the papers that I have shown to you shortly, the guidelines, etc., they are existing now in the 4th, 5th, or whatever edition, so we are constantly updating them, that they are always up to date. And we hope, nevertheless, we hope that finally we will get a European regulation on printing ink sometimes. We would be happy about a regulation because then our life is easier. We can just state compliance to the regulation and that's it. Now we have to do a lot of work, and this costs hours and hours for people like Evert, myself, and colleagues from all the UPIA members to develop these concepts because there is no regulation. Thank you very much. And now we are happy to take questions if you have some.
Thank you, Dr. Delbanco and Dr. Wülfert. Thank you for this very interesting overview. Do you have any questions? Hello, welcome back. Nice to see you.
Thank you. Dimitris Kouvalakidis from Mel Macedonian Paper Mill, located in Thessaloniki, Greece. We are producing cardboard, coated with raw material we are using waste paper. I think that the framework regulation 1935 examines the packaging of the end product of food. We have, in order to prove compliance as board producers, for example, the German legislation, BFR number 36. Since you have, let's say, as ink and coating producers, a new legislation, this will affect the national legislations, the German legislation of paper in food contact. Since I think that the ink manufacturers will be restricted somehow with a new regulation. That means that will be easier for the substrates?
I'm not sure, no. I don't think so. We have to, as a parallel supplier, we both have to do this work. And by the way, the European Carton Makers Association, they also have their concepts and guidelines. Good manufacturing practice, for example. Flexible packaging producers, films and foils, they have their own good manufacturing practice. Everybody supplying in this industry to make the final food packaging, they work similar as we do in order to fill these gaps. So as I said, it's not enough if you just take a printing ink which is fulfilling all the needs. The rest must fulfill it as well. Where the substance comes from at the end doesn't matter. If it comes from the board, then it's also not good if they exceed the limit.
So
doesn't matter. The ink is not enough.
So the result will be a safer product.
Yes.
As it is now.
No. I believe we are very safe already today.
Okay.
With all our concepts that we have developed ourselves, I have to say. Without them, of course, the world would look different. But we are waiting so long for regulations which we can fulfill that 20 years ago or even longer, the association decided we cannot wait any longer. We need to develop something in order to be sure that our members know what to do. Mm-hmm. And the similar in the other areas like paper and board, or flexible films and foils, etc. So I would say we are already safe. You don't need to worry about food packaging. Maybe sometimes, this is my personal opinion now, sorry for that, maybe sometimes the packaging is safer than what is inside.
Oh.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question. So, any further questions? Yes?
Hello, I'm Jose Novo from Toyo Inc.
Hello.
And I have two questions. One is regarding the Chinese regulation, the GB regulation. As you mentioned, it's a positive list and it's very short list, only around 200 substances. So is there any ink in the market currently that is compliant with this regulation? And I give you already the second question. The second question is about the German ink ordinance, which you mentioned is for food contact materials. It's not exactly for inks only, so the product has to be assessed as the final product. I understand that this is initially for products which are put into the market in Germany, independently where we printed them. But what happens if with other countries, surrounding countries, they will adopt also the same regulation, or as the Swiss ordinance become a de facto regulation, which is not official regulation?
Yeah, thank you. Good
Great
question.
questions, thank you.
Maybe Evert, you talk about China first.
Yes, maybe I talk about China first. First of all, I have to say that the Chinese ink ordinance will come into force in September. That means so far, strictly spoken, the principles are not applicable. But after September, We are facing a positive list of around 200 substances. I can hardly imagine that it is sufficient in order to produce compliant inks. No. The alternative would be to have unprinted packaging in future in China. I think that's not an alternative. Yeah? We will see what will happen. No?
Shall I take the
Yes.
German ink ordinance part? We have seen in Switzerland that the Swiss regulation, which is officially only valid in Switzerland, has a huge impact worldwide. For example, because big brand owners are requesting that the inks fulfill the regulation, no matter where they are used for this brand. Therefore, I assume that similar things will happen with the German ink ordinance. Officially, it's only valid for Germany, but it will spread. It will have influence outside of Germany as well. Of course, not only prints that are produced in Germany are covered by this regulation, also everything which is printed and comes into Germany is covered. And it might be that brand owners in the future will also say, please, we want to fulfill these articles for printing inks of the German Consumer Goods Ordinance as well. So I guess, yes, it will have a much bigger impact.
Yes, and if I can add, the economic impact of Germany is bigger than the economic impact of Switzerland, that's for sure. And secondly, compared to the Swiss ordinance, the German ink ordinance is applicable also for direct food contact, yeah? Which also makes a difference. Yeah? In order to refer to a positive list of substances which have been evaluated even for direct food contact.
Okay, I have a question related to that. So you talked about the transition period for the German ink ordinance. What happens after that transition period for already printed food contact materials?
This is clearly stated. Food contact material which is already printed before the 1st of January 2026 can be used. Used up until the stock is emptied. But you cannot print new stuff. Yeah? This has to fulfill then the ordinance.
But who regulates that? I mean, who enforces that? Sorry, not who regulates. Because regulation is always only as good as the enforcement.
Yeah.
What is the enforcement scenario?
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting one should try and get away with it, of course, but
no. Every state in Germany has its enforcement authorities, and they will pick up packaging from the market. They take real food packaging out of the shelf, and they test it. And if they find something which is not compliant with this regulation, they will go to the producer of the packaging. The producer will go to his suppliers and ask them, where does it come from, this substance which was found that is over the limit? And like this, maybe somebody will come to us and will say, could it be that it's coming from the ink? It will not be easy then to show where it comes from, because you cannot distinct if you test, for example, the food. Was it there already before it was packed? Does the substance come from migration over the shelf life? And if yes, where does it come from? Ink, coating, substrate, glue, etc., etc. It's not an easy task. I don't want to do this.
a bit frightening as a consumer, I must say.
Yes and no. There were cases 15, 20 years ago where only one such finding made a lot of fuss in the media, and this always leads then to the whole industry rethinking of their concepts, if they are still good enough. And you do not have to check every packaging. If you do it statistically, it is good enough at the end of the day, I'm pretty sure.
Okay. You mentioned the raw material suppliers. how do you encourage them to share data with you?
Sorry?
well,
Say
The
again?
raw material suppliers, how do you
Yes.
encourage them to share the data with you?
Okay. So we have questionnaires available, which are sent to raw material suppliers as long as the ink is finally used for sensitive applications. So it's not only food. So for example, we as Siegwerk, we also regard pharma packaging and hygiene packaging as sensitive application. And these suppliers receive a questionnaire, comprehensive questionnaire, which must be completed. This is a requirement prior to introducing new raw materials for sensitive applications.
Okay.
So we are also asking for non-intentionally added substances. Yeah?
Right.
If there are ingredients which are not intentionally added, we want to know everything. 100% disclosure.
Okay. And what percentage of information do you get back? I mean, how much of the questionnaire, is it 100% questionnaire is filled out?
If the supplier wants to wants to make business with us,
Has
of
to be
course,
100%. Okay.
he's enforced to provide the information. Yeah?
Okay. Any further questions? Your curiosity has been fulfilled. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you, Dr. Delbanco, Dr. Wülfert. Thanks for sharing your knowledge. A round of applause for our speakers.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.